Of you suffering, it says, as we have just heard in James chapter 5. Are any among you suffering? They should pray. Are any cheerful? That you should sing songs of praise. Are any among you sick? Call for the elders of the church and have them pray over them. When I was born, my parents named me James. They didn't know me well yet. But my mom told me when I was old enough to ask that they called me James because that was her absolute favorite book of the Bible. Later, years later, she insisted that she had never said that and that she named me James because she liked the name Jimmy. I didn't. But fortunately, by then I had acquired a different nickname. Still, I love the letter of James, and I think it might be my favorite book of the Bible. Today, we reach the fifth and last part of our sermon series on the Epistle of James. Pastor Lee, Pastor Andrea, and I have spent a lot of time with you going through the teachings of this fascinating and sometimes neglected epistle, uncovering some of its treasures. James is interesting for a few reasons. It really doesn't focus on the meaning of Jesus Christ as some of the other epistles do. Jesus only gets 2 mentions in the whole letter. The book of James instead focuses directly on the teachings of Jesus in the way the 20 other epistles in the New Testament really don't very much. And the message that James is preaching is an activist gospel focused on the things we need to do if we are going to think of ourselves as followers of Jesus. Be doers of the word and not hearers only who deceive themselves. Faith without action is a dead faith. And what good is it, my siblings, if someone says they have faith but have no work flowing from their faith? James would say, no good at all. But when we come to today's reading from the lectionary, from this final chapter of James, the culmination of the book, doesn't it seem a little bit weird that all the writer of James wants to tell us about is prayer? James asks a lot of questions, and the answer is always prayer. Are you suffering in some way? Then pray. Are any of you cheerful? Sing songs of praise. Are any among you sick? Call for members of the church and make them pray over the person. If that seems curious for this book of the Bible that's all about action and activism, the answer, I think, is this. For the writer of James, prayer is action. Praying is the ultimate form of activism because praying can help ensure that our own will is better aligned with the will of God, so that our own actions better line up with the will and way of God, the way of compassion and justice, of love and reconciliation. Prayer is kind of a strange thing, and it's a little foreign to a lot of us, even some of us who spend a lot of time in church. Prayer, there's something about prayer that's a little bit odd, and there's something about prayer that's a little bit scary. When I was a teenager, I realized that I was afraid to pray. I thought that if I went to God and sincerely opened myself to what God might have to say to me, that I might end up having to do things that I didn't want to do, like go into the ministry. More recently, I was taking a long subway ride, and I was using the downtime to catch up on my prayers, sitting on the subway with my eyes closed, my head down, and I guess I looked a little strange because somebody tapped my foot and asked me if I was okay, and I said, Yeah, I'm fine. I guess I was just nodding off. Late night, he asked. I said, yeah. And it struck me then that I was somehow more comfortable having this random stranger think that I'd been out all night partying rather than admit that I'd been sitting there having a talk with God. Well, that's one thing the church is actually good for. Church is a community that normalizes this strange practice of talking with God. That powerful, intimidating, but ultimately effective action of prayer. Because prayer leads to action, bold action, brave action, the kind of action that's sometimes required if we are going to put life into our prayer life. In a few minutes, you'll meet Lila, who has come to be baptized today. When we were talking the other day, she and I, Lila shared a remarkable story about her family. Her parents met as teenagers in Bulgaria during the Second World War, at a time when Bulgaria had fallen under Nazi rule. Her dad's family were Christian, and her mom's people were Jewish. When an order came to deport thousands of Bulgaria's Jewish citizens, Lila's Christian great-grandfather, who was an advisor to the king of Bulgaria, took a bold step and petitioned the king to halt the deportation that would have led to so many deaths. Fortunately, the petition was successful, and many were permitted to escape and survive. Lila shared with me a translation of the letter, and a part of it goes like this. He writes, I protest the cruel persecution of Bulgarian Jewry, now awaiting relocation and deportation. Having been shrewdly robbed, they are now being sent to physical destruction and certain death. I therefore raise my voice of indignation against the insanity of a policy that sentences Bulgarian Jews to sure and senseless annihilation. And I beseech your majesty to stop the order immediately. When I later shared that story with Pastor Lee, she said, it sounds just like the story of Esther in the Bible. And then we realized that, strangely, the book of Esther was one of the lectionary readings for this Sunday. It was one of those coincidences that make you realize that there aren't any coincidences. In today's reading from Esther, as we've just heard, Queen Esther is given a risky task by her uncle Mordecai to go to King Ahasuerus and petition for the lives of her people. I say risky because at that time to go to the king without being summoned was punishable by death according to the law. Esther's uncle famously persuades her with the words, "Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your position of royal privilege for such a time as this." Esther takes on the task with resigned resolution, summed up in her equally famous response, "I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." There have been moments in our years together here when we've been faced with such a time as this. Times and occasions when following Jesus has seemed to require challenging those in power to do the right thing. I think of those 14 months when our friend Deborah and her family sought refuge and sanctuary here in the church in order to keep Deborah from being deported into danger and tearing her family apart. Every week, some of you would take on the unpleasant task of going downtown to the offices of ICE to request a stay of deportation for Deborah. And for months, the only official response was to threaten us with arrest for harboring a fugitive. Until finally, we wore them down, and the government agreed to consider Deborah's case for asylum. I think of times through the years when some of you actually were arrested, protesting the sin of racism in South Africa, or police brutality, or fossil fuel companies whose policies are leading to climate change, or senseless and cruel wars, or other matters I temporarily put out of my mind. But what I really want us to think about here today is that such times as these may well come again. And if they do, we will need prayer. We will need prayer. A lot of prayer. The kind of prayer that leads into action. Prayer like what Rabbi Abraham Heschel experienced while marching with Dr. King down in Selma, Alabama. As he later said, I felt like it was my legs that were praying. Because far away and nearby, people are still being rounded up and deported and put in situations of peril and hardship for no reason other than cynicism, selfishness, sometimes mere convenience. Far away and nearby, kids are still being targeted and trafficked, like the girls we've met through our work with GEMS. Far away and nearby, we know that every day innocent people are killed, and in some places, the instruments of their death are marked "Made in America." Far away and nearby, the worship of guns threatens to replace the worship of the God of love, and our infatuation with guns sometimes seems to exceed our love for school children. Far away and nearby, immigrants are slandered, women's lives are threatened, trans kids are bullied to death, and as we have seen, far away and nearby, storms and floods and droughts stemming from climate change threaten lives and livelihoods, fueled by denials and lies and our own wishful thinking. So who knows? Who knows? At some point, you may find that you have come to your position of whatever privilege you have for such a time as this. And in such times, we would do well to be driven to prayer. The kind of prayer we find in that 5th chapter of the letter of James. The kind of prayer that helps us find a way when there's no way. The kind of prayer that is a powerful petition demanding healing or even just God's close presence in an impossibly perilous time. The kind of prayer that leads to a demand for justice. The kind of prayer that leads to a faithful form of activism. The kind of prayer that is, by its very nature, action. Who knows? Who knows?